evening was already surrendering to a chill October wind when I happened, quite by accident, upon the first signs of mischief. I had just returned from a brief, entirely unenlightening meeting with the late Miss Peabody, a lady of questionable taste in hats and tiresome devotion to minor philanthropy, when I noted that something was amiss in the otherwise sedate thoroughfare of Little St. Aldhelms. The gaslights, each a lonely sentinel, cast elongated shadows across the cobbles. One lamp, however, stubbornly refused to glow. I am nothing if not attentive to such civic discrepancies, and so I paused, hat in hand, to examine the void. A window on the first floor of number 17 gaped like an open mouth, a window without glass. It is a curious sensation to see a pane of glass absent without warning, as if it had been spirited away by a polite poltergeist. I should not have been surprised, for Little St. Aldhelms was not immune to eccentricities, but one is never quite prepared for domestic dereliction in a neighborhood otherwise punctilious about its gravel paths and rose bushes. While peering upwards, I caught the faint strains of music drifting from the street below. A violin, somewhat out of tune, played by a youth whose ambition outweighed his skill. There is an art to playing badly with such commitment, and it deserves a certain admiration, though one might prefer it unaccompanied by the melancholy of a missing lamp and a window wide open to the chill. I could not help noting, in passing, that a brass doorknob on number 17 was scratched in a peculiar manner, as though someone had been in a hurry or hurriedly apologetic. It was only when I stepped closer that I noticed the absence of something else, a small brass oil lamp, the sort commonly used to illuminate the modest staircase within the house. It had vanished as completely as the window's glass, leaving behind a faint trace of soot on the worn oak balustrade. A neighbor, peering from behind a lace curtain, whispered of a strange gentleman seen lingering about an hour before dusk. Naturally, she could recall no further detail, though she insisted on a tremendous air of malevolence surrounding his demeanor. One must always treat such reports with caution, particularly from those with a fondness for melodrama. Still, there is utility in noting what the neighbors insist they know nothing of. It was in this precise moment, listening to the lilt of the violin and examining the twin mysteries of window and lamp, that I found myself silently approving of fate's timing. For a vanished lamp and a gap in the glass might mean nothing to the ordinary passer-by. To me, however, they suggested a story, a breach of domestic propriety, and perhaps a beginning. And so I lingered on the cobbles, tipping my head with what I trust was the correct balance of curiosity and hauteur. Little did I know that this seemingly trivial irregularity would, in the days to come, illuminate matters far darker than a missing lamp. Meanwhile, the violinist's bow jerked with increasing desperation, and I resolved, with some reluctance, to make inquiries within number 17 at the earliest opportunity. It is a curious trait of mine, the inclination to investigate, even when the initial crime is, by all appearances, nothing more sinister than bad manners and absent household fixtures. The following morning found me at the doorstep of number 17, where the early mist clung stubbornly to the cobbles, and the windows of neighboring houses stared down like disapproving eyes. I rang the bell with the precision of a man accustomed to announcing himself to unprepared hosts. The door opened almost immediately, as though expecting me, though I assured myself that was merely a trick of the imagination. Inside, the house retained an air of genteel disorder, the kind which suggests that the family in residence is at once both refined and entirely careless of the little inconveniences which polite society deems intolerable. I was greeted by Mrs. Pargeter, a stout woman with a face like overbaked pastry and a nervous, fluttering air about her hands. Her apron, embroidered with floral motifs of a cheerful if unconvincing sort, seemed determined to conceal more than it revealed. I don't know how I can help you, sir," she began, her voice trembling slightly, though she stoutly refused to meet my eyes. Nothing at all. Absolutely nothing has happened, I assure you. Indeed, I said, inclining my head with the faintest suggestion of irony. And yet I noticed a conspicuous absence of glass in the first-floor window and, if I may venture, a missing lamp. Small matters, to be sure, but intriguing, I think you will admit. Her eyes widened with a mixture of shock and relief, as though the mention of trivial objects had granted her permission to speak. The lamp, sir. Yes, it is gone. And the window. Oh, I thought perhaps it had been left open by the wind, but... She paused, glancing nervously toward the stairs. We have had a visitor, though I hardly like to speak of it. Ah, I said, my interest piqued by the careful hesitation. A visitor, you say? Do tell me more. Time and dates, if you can. One finds precision quite helpful in such matters. She swallowed, fumbling with her apron. It was yesterday late afternoon. A gentleman called himself Mr. Armitage. Very polite, but rather insistent. He asked after my mistress, and when I told him she was out, he waited. He lingered, I dare say, near the window you noticed. Perhaps he... She faltered, as though the notion of explanation itself were improper. Mr. Armitage, I repeated softly, making a note in my mind. Names, even if ordinary, often conceal extraordinary intentions. And your mistress? She is away, you say. When did she depart? Since the morning, Mrs. Pargeter replied, quickly. She had letters to attend to in London. Nothing unusual for her, I assure you, but the window... I thought it strange that it remained open when I returned. I observed her closely. Her lips trembled, yet her fingers maintained the fluttering insistence of concealment. This is a curious habit among the servants, I reflected, to understate what is in fact most telling. There was a contradiction here, minor but significant. She insisted nothing had occurred, yet her manner betrayed awareness of an intruder. The lamp, the open window, the mysterious visitor, all converged to form a subtle pattern of intrusion and oversight. I see, I said at last, allowing the comment to hang in the air like the last notes of the violin from the previous evening. And is there anyone else in the house? Any other staff who might corroborate your observations? Yes, sir. Only Mr. Fenwick, the butler, though he is most particular and rather severe. He would never... She stopped abruptly, apparently aware of having said too much. Then we shall speak with him, I suggested lightly, masking my growing amusement. There is nothing more revealing than the severe and conscientious. They often confess to what they imagine they have merely observed. I was shown into the main hallway, where the lingering scent of beeswax and aged oak mingled with something less definable, an undercurrent of anxiety, faint yet persistent. It is here, I reflected, in these well-kept yet tensioned spaces, that human duplicity often first manifests. At the top of the stairs, Mr. Fenwick appeared, statuesque in his severity, like a marble sentinel brought to life. He bowed without a word, the kind of bow that suggested obedience to decorum more than friendliness. "Good morning, Mr. Fenwick," I began, keeping my tone even, deliberately disarming. "I wish to inquire about yesterday afternoon. Were you aware of any visitors, unusual sounds, or misplaced objects in the house?" He regarded me for a long moment, his face an unreadable mask. "I'm a servant, sir. I attend to my duties. I observed nothing. I assure you, nothing unusual occurred." "Ah, but the lamp," I prompted gently, noting the imperceptible twitch in his left eye. "And the window? Both absent or open, as circumstances may be?" Fenwick's hand rose slowly to adjust his cuffs, a gesture almost imperceptible in its nervous precision. "The lamp. It is missing, yes," he admitted finally, his voice low. "I noted it myself. As for the window, I observed it open when I entered this morning. How it came to be so, I cannot say. Nothing unusual, sir." Nothing at all. I inclined my head, the faintest of smiles touching my lips. So the ostensibly infallible butler, the vigilant observer, acknowledged a fact yet sought to mask its implications. That, I decided, would prove instructive in time. The pattern was emerging. A missing lamp, an open window, a mysterious visitor, and a household determined to maintain appearances while concealing truths far subtler than they suspected. And thus the domestic fabric began to unravel before me, each thread leading inexorably toward the questions yet unasked, the kind of questions whose answers might, in a very short while, reveal motives far darker than negligence or forgetfulness. It was in the late afternoon, when the sun had begun its careful descent and shadows lengthened across the drawing-room floor, that I encountered my first truly tangible lead. Mr. Fenwick had departed to tend to household duties, his expression as immovable as ever, and Mrs. Pargeter had retreated to the kitchen, muttering prayers for courage or perhaps for the disappearance of my curiosity. I was left alone with the silence of the house, a silence that, in a residence of such age and habit, speaks more than voices ever could. It was then that a visitor arrived, a gentleman of middle age, impeccably dressed, yet with a manner that betrayed impatience, restrained by social convention. He introduced himself as Mr. Alistair Dane, a solicitor from London, claiming to have business concerning the absent mistress of the house. His eyes, however, betrayed a keener interest in the domestic arrangements than any professional courtesy might justify. "I understand, Mr. Wimsey," he said, bowing ever so slightly, "that you have taken an interest in minor anomalies, the lamp, the window, and the like. I assure you these are matters of no consequence." "Of no consequence," I repeated archly, "except, of course, to those who prefer their minor disturbances unexamined. And yet, in my experience, it is precisely in these trifles that one discovers the true character of events." He flushed faintly, but quickly recovered his composure. "Very well," he said, "but I must insist that the household maintains its usual tranquility. Rumor spreads faster than reason in these villages." I allowed a smile, entirely innocuous, to touch my lips. Rumor, indeed, but also meticulous observation, which spreads far less visibly, yet with far greater consequence. I noted, as he spoke, the slight wrinkle at the corner of his left eye, the subtle tension in the right shoulder, and the restless tapping of his cane. A trifling detail, perhaps, yet one which might suggest impatience, concealment, or anxiety. "Tell me, Mr. Dane," I began, "did you, or anyone you know, visit this house yesterday in the late afternoon?" He hesitated, and though his reply was prompt, it carried the slightest tremor of calculation. "I was in the village, yes," he admitted. "Merely passing by, I assure you. My business required no visit to number 17. I allowed the statement to stand, filing it away as a possible truth, but one that demanded verification. Timing is an exacting mistress, and even the most polished statements often fail against the clock and the attentive eye. Before I could pursue the matter further, a sudden commotion in the street drew our attention. A small crowd had gathered near the corner of the house, and the sound of the violinist's efforts, strident now and bordering on shrill, filled the air. I noted that the street lamp nearest the house, which had been extinguished the previous evening, remained dark. A deliberate choice, perhaps, or merely coincidental. Yet in a village so fastidious about its appearances, coincidence is rarely so neatly aligned. I excused myself and approached the throng. Among the onlookers was a young boy, no more than 10, clutching a small bundle. With some coaxing, he revealed that it contained fragments of glass and what he claimed to be a portion of the missing lamp. His story was, as one might expect from one of such tender years, slightly inconsistent, yet not without utility. The shards were indeed of the same glass that had adorned the window, and a portion of the lamp's brass casing bore a subtle dent, as though it had been handled roughly. Returning indoors, I pondered the implications. Someone had entered the house. Someone had removed, or attempted to remove, objects of minor, almost symbolic value. The motive, however, remained obscure. In the world of the criminal mind, trifles are often proof of intent or practice for acts yet to come. It was then that a faint noise, a barely audible creak above the drawing-room ceiling, drew my attention. I paused, listening. The house was otherwise silent. Another creak, then a sound as if a door had been nudged ajar somewhere on the first floor. I ascended the stairs slowly, my hand brushing the polished balustrade, each step measured and deliberate. At the top of the landing, I noticed a shadow flit across the corridor. It vanished before I could focus on it, yet its presence left a chill that no mere draught could account for. The corridor, like the household itself, was both orderly and subtly disquieting. One could sense, beneath the veneer of civility, a series of concealed anxieties, small, meticulous, and significant. By the time I returned to the drawing room, my mind was already constructing the beginnings of a hypothesis. The intruder, the lamp, the window, the fragments found by the boy, all were pieces of a puzzle yet incomplete, and I knew with that quiet certainty which comes from long practice that the household's secrets would reveal themselves in time if only one observed the trivial with sufficient care. It was then that I resolved to begin the interviews of those not yet spoken to. Neighbors, errant tradesmen, and any who might have noticed the visitor whose presence had upset the domestic equilibrium. For in matters of deduction, every inconsequential remark, every nervous glance, every hurried gesture might prove to be the very key that unlocks a door previously invisible. And so, as the light waned and the village settled into a cautious evening, I prepared to gather those fragments of observation into a pattern that I suspected would lead us to truths far more unsettling than missing glass or a vanished lamp. The following morning brought with it a persistent drizzle, the kind that clings to the stonework and makes even the most orderly street seem washed with ambiguity. I resolved to begin inquiries among the neighbors, believing firmly that the invisible threads of observation often stretch beyond the household itself. Mrs. Pargeter, armed with a small notebook of her own devising, accompanied me with the sort of nervous enthusiasm one reserves for minor catastrophes. Our first stop was the house directly opposite number 17, where a middle-aged widow named Mrs. Gresham kept a careful eye on the street. She received us with the sort of polite wariness that suggests the habit of listening rather than speaking. I inquired casually whether she had noticed any unusual visitors the previous afternoon. Yes, I suppose, she admitted after a pause, arranging her shawl with meticulous care. A gentleman lingered near the lamp outside number 17. Tall, dark coat, a hat pulled low over his eyes. He seemed impatient yet courteous, in a rather studied way. "And the time?" I asked, allowing my tone to convey an easy interest, as though the minutiae of the hour mattered solely to me. "About 4:30, perhaps. I was taking my tea at the window, and the boy with the violin was just finishing his practice. I saw the man glance up at the open window, then peer quickly at the lamp." I inclined my head thoughtfully. 4:30 in the afternoon. The very period during which the fragments of glass had been found and the brass lamp had vanished. The timeline was tightening with each observation, the outline of events growing more distinct, if still incomplete. Our next inquiries brought confirmation of the stranger's presence. The postman, Mr. Eddington, recalled a similar figure hurrying past on the main road, muttering to himself with the apparent irritation of one whose plans have been delayed. The pattern emerged clearly. Someone had arrived with purpose, surveyed the household from without, and departed without obvious detection. It was a trivial intrusion on the surface, yet every detail, time, posture, mannerisms, spoke to deliberate intent. Returning to number 17, I was met by a surprising development. A letter had been delivered for the absent mistress. It was a commonplace envelope, neatly addressed, yet I noted a peculiar aspect of the handwriting. The final loop of the signature trailed downward in a manner most unusual, almost as if the writer had been distracted. or careful to disguise the motion of the pen. Small matters, yes, but such minor eccentricities are rarely without significance. While examining the envelope, I became aware of the subtle interplay of the household staff. Fenwick had returned from his morning duties, his expression unyielding, yet I detected the tiniest flicker of curiosity in his eyes. Mrs. Pargeter hovered in the background, attempting, I suspected, to appear busy, yet managing only the illusion of occupation. "Have you observed any other irregularities since yesterday?" I asked lightly, as if seeking confirmation for what I already suspected. Fenwick's gaze met mine for a moment, and then he inclined his head. "Nothing unusual, sir. Merely the ordinary disturbances of daily life." "Ordinary indeed," I murmured, allowing a faint smile. It is the ordinary, when examined closely, that most often betrays the extraordinary. At that precise moment, a carriage rattled past the gates, and the village constable appeared at the door, hat in hand. He carried the air of someone eager to find a resolution, his mind leaning toward the most obvious explanation. "I hear tell there's been some tampering, sir," he said, addressing me rather more formally than necessity dictated. "Glass broken, lamp gone, and all that. Mrs. Pargeter insists it's nothing, of course, but, well, you understand the sort of thing that puts folk on edge." "Indeed I do," I said. "And pray, whom do you suspect?" The constable's eyes flickered toward Fenwick, then Mrs. Pargeter, and finally rested on me, seeking encouragement. "Well, there's young Master Collins, lives a few doors down, prone to mischief, angry at the mistress for some trifling slight, I hear. We were considering speaking to him." I allowed my smile to widen slightly, the faintest trace of dry amusement touching my features. It is always the obvious suspect, the one nearest to hand, who provides the most delicious distraction. Collins, I reflected, would make an excellent red herring, eager, hot-headed, and, by the look of him, ready to claim guilt even where none existed. Yet, as I observed the constable's eagerness, the careful way Fenwick's hands remained folded behind him, and the subtle tremor in Mrs. Pargeter's apron, I knew that the story was far more intricate than a boy's petty vendetta. The missing lamp and the window without glass were but openings, not conclusions. And it is in the openings, I thought, where the mind is stretched and the truth can slip quietly through unnoticed. Thus, as the rain continued its delicate tapping against the window panes, I prepared to interrogate young Master Collins. I had every intention of allowing the constable to follow the obvious path, while I pursued the subtler threads, the timing, the shadows, the mannerisms, all the minutiae that, when carefully assembled, reveal motives far deeper than mere mischief. And in that quiet, methodical preparation, I felt the faint thrill that only comes when the first curtain of deception begins to tremble under the weight of exact observation. I called upon young Master Collins in the drawing-room shortly thereafter, a bright, mischievous boy with a shock of unruly hair and a face determined to look either startled or innocent, depending on which angle he assumed. He greeted me with a combination of bravado and apprehension, as though unsure whether to be proud of his notoriety or fearful of its consequences. "Good afternoon, Master Collins," I said, seating myself in a chair deliberately positioned to study him without intimidation. "I'm told you may have been present in the neighborhood yesterday. Can you recall your movements between 3 and 5 o'clock?" He blinked rapidly, as though the question were designed to entrap him. I was at home, sir, doing lessons, mostly. Mother says I mustn't wander. I didn't go near number 17 at all." "Indeed," I replied, allowing my tone to carry an air of polite skepticism rather than accusation. "And yet several witnesses noted a figure of a boy about your height and age near the street corner, observing the house rather intently. Perhaps another of similar age and mischievous spirit?" Collins hesitated, and I observed the flicker of color in his cheeks. "No, sir, that wasn't me. I promise." I allowed a faint smile. Children often exaggerate truth or invent modesty when confronted, yet the manner in which they do so can reveal more than their words. I see. Then let us speak of what you might have seen from your window. The violinist, perhaps? Any unusual visitors passing the house? He fidgeted with his cuffs, clearly uncertain how much to reveal. There was a man, yes, a tall man. I didn't see his face. He looked angry, I think, but I didn't know what he wanted. Ah, I said, feigning distraction. A tall man, and angry, you say? Perhaps he wished to retrieve something he had lost, or to inspect something not meant for his eyes. One never knows the intentions of strangers, Master Collins. He nodded solemnly, clearly relieved that I had not accused him directly. And in that relief, he revealed the first crack in the red herring. If he had not ventured toward the house, yet observed an intruder, it narrowed the pool of possible suspects considerably. Timing, too, became critical. The stranger had been present between 4 and 4:30, coinciding exactly with the arrival of fragments recovered by the boy in the street. I let Collins depart after a few more polite questions and reflected on the pattern. It was, as I had suspected, too neat for the obvious suspect, a mischievous boy, visible to witnesses, incapable of removing a brass lamp with the subtlety required. The narrative suggested deliberation, a precision that only an adult hand, or at least a confident and practiced one, could have accomplished. Turning my attention back to the household, I began asking the staff what they had observed about the stranger's mannerisms. Fenwick, predictably, maintained his stoic facade, but let slip a curious remark about the way the man had glanced toward the hallway's mirror, as if counting reflections rather than rooms. Mrs. Pargeter, meanwhile, recalled that the intruder had muttered under his breath some incoherent string of letters or numbers while examining the lamp. It is often the smallest observations that prove decisive. A glance at a mirror, a muttered code. These are not the actions of a mere opportunist or mischievous neighbor. They point instead to planning, to intention, to knowledge of the household's layout and routine. By the end of the morning, I had begun to construct a provisional timeline. The stranger arrived between 4 and 4:30, inspected the lamp and window, handled the objects with care and a measure of urgency, and departed before any adult witness could approach. The fragments discovered by the boy in the street were likely dropped in haste, unintentional, yet revealing. It was at this point, standing in the quiet of the drawing-room and examining the slight dents in the recovered brass, that I began to perceive the faintest psychological signature in the intruder's behavior. A meticulous, almost obsessive concern with appearances, combined with an anxiety about being observed. One does not remove a lamp or glass without thought. One does not glance repeatedly at mirrors without reason. These were not actions born of whim, but of purpose. And so the red herring, young Collins and his predictable temperament, dissolved almost entirely, leaving the investigation poised on the cusp of the more subtle concealed truths. The true visitor, the pattern of intrusion, and the psychological imprint left behind in the smallest of gestures. Therein lay the challenge and the reward of a case so superficially simple, yet intricately human beneath its polite veneer. I closed my notebook and allowed myself a moment's reflection. The stage was set, the players observed, and the narrative threads beginning to converge. It was only a matter of careful, patient deduction, and of allowing the household's concealed truths to reveal themselves in the smallest, most telling details. I returned to the house that afternoon with a particular purpose in mind: to observe, question, and gently unsettle the domestic routine without giving any hint of the direction my thoughts were taking. There is, as I have often found, a distinct advantage in letting others believe one's attention is engaged with trivialities, while in reality one is assembling a far more intricate mental map. I began with the clocks. It may seem, to the uninitiated, an oddly pedantic place to start, Yet even the most minor discrepancies can reveal the contours of intention. The hall clock, a stately, brass-faced timepiece, ticked with admirable precision, while the grandfather clock in the drawing room lagged ever so slightly, by perhaps 20 seconds over the course of an hour. Fenwick, observing my scrutiny, offered a faint smile of thin disapproval. "Does the clock matter, sir?" he inquired, his tone meant to discourage, yet betraying a curiosity he could not entirely suppress. "Only insofar as the perception of time influences behavior," I replied lightly. "For instance, if a visitor arrives at 4:30 and the housekeeper's watch differs from the hall clock, then even the most punctual of servants may misreport the precise sequence of events. Such matters are rarely as trivial as they appear." Fenwick said nothing further, but I observed the brief, imperceptible tightening of his jaw. It is always instructive to see which details prick the conscience, even in the most disciplined of household staff. Next, I turned my attention to the curtains and drapery, allowing my fingers to linger upon the folds with deliberate slowness, noting the direction of light, the presence of dust, and the slight fraying along the edges. Mrs. Pargeter hovered, anxious and watchful, and I asked innocuous questions about who usually adjusted the blinds and whether they were always closed at a particular hour. Each answer seemed banal, yet each carried a subtle clue. The west-facing curtains, for example, had been hastily adjusted within the last 24 hours, just enough to suggest either a hurried visitor or an unobserved glance from the street. I moved to the furniture next, noting the small impressions in the carpet, the slight shift of a side chair, and the way certain items had been returned to the shelves with a precision that was at once exacting and nervously hurried. Here, the psychology of the intruder began to reveal itself more clearly. A man accustomed to order, yet unaccustomed to being observed. Small deviations were irritating to him, but his haste betrayed an overriding priority to inspect, remove, and leave without drawing attention. Then, as though by chance, my attention was caught by the faint scent of wax and soot lingering near the fireplace. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it suggested that the lamp, once removed, had been lit, or at least handled, before it was discarded or carried off. Such a detail may appear inconsequential, yet it indicates method, intent, and perhaps even a measure of carelessness. Throughout the day, I peppered questions upon Mrs. Pargeter and Fenwick about the routine of the household, the regularity of visitors, the particular habits of the mistress. My tone was light, almost teasing, as though I were genuinely concerned with idle curiosity rather than investigation. Yet in the replies, the hesitations, the repeated corrections, and the carefully framed denials, the pattern of the intruder's movements and methods began to emerge. By evening, I had constructed a subtle yet increasingly coherent image. A stranger, deliberate and precise, had entered the house, noted the lamp and the window, perhaps lit the lamp, and departed in a controlled haste. Every trivial object, every alignment of furniture and curtain, every tick of a clock contributed to the portrait, and yet, for all this, the intruder remained unobserved in his true identity, concealed beneath layers of civility and assumed invisibility. As I stood in the drawing room, watching the candlelight flicker across the walls, I allowed myself a faint smile. The household, in its polite order, had begun to reveal its small secrets, not in grand declarations, but in the subtleties of timing, shadow, and gesture. And it is always in such subtleties that one finds the key to unraveling even the most superficially simple of disturbances. The following morning brought a clarity to the mist-laden streets of Little St. Aldhelms that allowed observation to take on the precision of measurement. I had resolved to reassemble the timeline of events surrounding the disappearance of the lamp and the window's glass, for it was now evident that minor inconsistencies held the key to understanding the intruder's methods. I began with Mrs. Pargeter, who had grown more confident after my previous inquiries, yet remained unwilling to volunteer more than the barest facts. "The lamp was last in place just before my mistress departed," she said, "and the window— I noticed it open when I returned from the kitchen, but I was not certain when it had been so. Perhaps an hour or so after she left." Fenwick, ever precise, supplied the interval between the mistress's departure and his first inspection, nearly an hour and a quarter. I entered the drawing room to light the hall lamp, and the window was already open. I observed nothing else unusual at the time. With these points, I began to chart the sequence. Mistress departs in the morning. Fenwick enters roughly an hour and 15 minutes later. Window found open. Lamp missing. Fragments discovered by the boy in the street by late afternoon. The violinist's performance overlaps all these occurrences. The pattern, though seemingly ordinary, contained subtle discrepancies. One detail in particular caught my attention: the positioning of shadows in the drawing room, according to the sun's path and the partially closed curtains. The fragments of glass could not have fallen in the position observed by the boy if they had been removed exactly when Fenwick claimed to have first seen the window. Either the fragments had been displaced afterward, or the timing of the intruder's entry required adjustment. I returned to the fragments, handling them with careful gloves. Each shard of glass, each dented piece of brass, bore traces of soot, as though the lamp had indeed been lit, even briefly. The movement implied planning. The intruder required illumination to inspect the lamp and window, suggesting a man who worked systematically, and perhaps even alone. The psychological pattern was emerging. One does not handle a lamp so deliberately if one is unpracticed. One does not glance repeatedly at mirrors without the faintest awareness of being observed. Small actions, when examined collectively, reveal far more than casual witnesses perceive. By mid-afternoon, I was prepared to confront a more subtle inconsistency: the violinist. His music, erratic and frequently sharp, coincided suspiciously with the timing of the intruder's activities. Could a young boy, even one enthusiastic, account for such precision in alerting or masking the intruder's movements? The notion seemed improbable. Yet it remained a factor in the chronology. The music provided both cover and inadvertent confirmation of timing. It was then that a minor but intriguing observation seized my attention. The sideboard in the drawing room, usually aligned with meticulous care, bore a slight, almost imperceptible tilt toward the fireplace. Someone had leaned against it, intentionally or not, as if in the act of either leaving or retrieving something. The mark was recent. The wax on the floor bore tiny smudges not consistent with everyday use. These combined irregularities, clock discrepancies, curtain adjustments, carpet impressions, soot traces, shifted furniture, suggested a methodical intrusion, one where each small act was governed by deliberate care and awareness of observation. And yet the intruder had erred somewhere, leaving the faintest trail for those accustomed to noticing the trivial. I returned to the window itself, noting the pattern of splintered wood where the glass had been removed. It was a clean break, executed with enough care to avoid noise, yet leaving a subtle trace of human presence. Fingerprints obscured but detectable to one who knew precisely what to look for. It is in such minor details, I reflected, that a carefully concealed truth begins to assert itself against the misdirection of witnesses and servants alike. By evening, I had reconstructed a coherent, if tentative, sequence of the intrusion. The visitor arrived mid-afternoon, used the lamp briefly, manipulated the window to gain access, and departed with fragments left behind in haste. Each element fit into the chronology, yet something remained unresolved, a psychological inconsistency that hinted at a motive deeper than simple theft or mischief. As I sat in the drawing room, pen in hand, I considered the next step. The timeline was now sufficiently precise to allow targeted questioning, and the subtle psychological signature of the intruder had begun to emerge. One could almost see the meticulous planning, the care in concealment, and the faint anxiety at being observed, all clues that promised to illuminate not merely what had occurred, but why. And so, with the sun dipping low and shadows lengthening along the walls, I prepared to probe the household further, focusing on habits, small routines, and personal idiosyncrasies. Those elements that, in the hands of an attentive observer, reveal far more than casual testimony ever could. The next morning, I resolved to extend my inquiries beyond the obvious household and village actors. It is a curious feature of human behavior that the truth often resides not in those most visible, but in those whose lives intersect with circumstance only briefly, yet deliberately. I began with the deliveries and correspondence arriving for the mistress, each a minor thread which might unravel a larger design. One letter in particular drew my attention. Delivered by the postman, its envelope bore the same peculiar downward flourish I had noted in an earlier communication. The ink was slightly smudged, as if applied in haste or under duress, and the seal faintly disturbed, enough to suggest tampering, yet subtle, almost imperceptible. It was a small detail, but when combined with the previous anomalies, the lamp, the window, the fragmentary evidence, it began to form a psychological outline of a visitor who was both deliberate and nervous, meticulous yet slightly impatient. I returned to the drawing room to examine the window once more. Something, a nuance I had overlooked, now struck me with clarity. The latch had been manipulated from the outside, not the inside. The intruder had either possessed a key or possessed knowledge of its mechanism. This small fact, nearly invisible to the casual observer, suggested more than curiosity or petty theft. It implied familiarity with the household, or at the very least, access to information ordinarily restricted. While pondering these details, I questioned Mrs. Pargeter and Fenwick further, probing habits, minor routines, and daily rhythms. I inquired not only about doors and windows, but about the mistress herself, her proclivities, her absences, her most habitual patterns. It became increasingly evident that the intruder had studied these with precision. Fenwick, in his immovable way, admitted to having noticed nothing unusual, yet his slight hesitation when discussing the mistress's departures betrayed awareness of a secret, or at the very least, a discomfort with disclosure. Then a revelation came in the form of a remark by Mrs. Pargeter. She mentioned casually that the mistress had recently entertained a visitor who had claimed to be a distant relative. He had stayed only briefly, yet something about his presence had unsettled the household staff. I filed this information with deliberate care. The implication was subtle, almost entirely psychological, yet unmistakable. There was a man known, yet not entirely known, who had gained access under the guise of civility. I began to reconstruct a possible scenario. A man of polished manners, familiar enough to observe and manipulate, yet retaining the caution of a stranger in a household not his own. His intrusion was measured, deliberate, and psychologically informed. He had accessed the lamp and window, yet avoided detection by exploiting small routines and habits. His errors, the fragments in the street, the smudged seal, were incidental, revealing only what an attentive observer could discern. By evening, I had reached the point where observation alone suggested the presence of a double life. A man who maintained one identity publicly, yet assumed another when opportunity presented itself. This was no petty thief or mischievous boy. The intruder was methodical, precise, and motivated by considerations beyond the trivial. In the ordinary motions of the household, clock discrepancies, curtain adjustments, carpet impressions, he had left a signature of calculation, subtly imperceptible to those who did not know what to seek. I considered next steps carefully. The timeline was sufficiently precise to allow focused questioning, yet incomplete. The psychological outline suggested intent, yet lacked confirmation. The double life, or at least a concealed identity, demanded exposure, but with caution. One does not reveal a predator prematurely, lest the prey retreat behind further secrecy. As I sat in the drawing room, the low candlelight flickering across the walls, I allowed myself a faint smile. The household surface civility had begun to crumble under the weight of meticulous observation. In the minor irregularities, the faint scratches, the careful shifts of furniture, the small smudges of ink and wax, the intruder's presence was asserted. And I knew, with the quiet certainty of one who has spent long hours reading human character, that the truth, when finally unveiled, would be as psychologically intricate as it was logically inevitable. The following morning I devoted myself to testing the chronology I had so carefully reconstructed. It is one thing to observe. It is quite another to verify that the observed sequence aligns with temporal reality. I began with the placement of the fragments in the street, retracing the boy's steps, noting the intervals at which he had collected the pieces, and comparing them to the period during which Fenwick had inspected the drawing room. It became immediately apparent that some elements did not cohere. The fragment's final location suggested that the lamp had been removed slightly later than Fenwick's inspection indicated, perhaps by 20 or 30 minutes. This discrepancy, though minor, suggested either error or intentional manipulation, and in a household accustomed to precision, I leaned toward the latter. I returned to the window, examining the latch and frame with renewed care. A faint smear of soot remained near the inner edge, a mark inconsistent with an ordinary breeze or the accidental handling of glass. It implied that the lamp had been lit while the window was open, a measure taken either to illuminate a precise action or to conceal one's own movements. Timing, in other words, was not accidental. With these points in mind, I questioned Fenwick and Mrs. Pargeter anew, this time focusing on the sequences of their own actions. Each reply, carefully weighed, carried subtle contradictions. Mrs. Pargeter adjusted her apron nervously when stating the hour of the mistress's departure. Fenwick's hand, resting behind his back, betrayed a minor tremor as he described his entrance into the drawing room. Small, nearly imperceptible details, yet they suggested awareness beyond what they claimed to have observed. It was then that a most instructive detail came to light. The violinist, whom I had previously regarded as incidental, had begun practicing at precisely the moment that the lamp was being handled, or so the pattern of shadow and light indicated. A subtle alignment of sound and movement had allowed the intruder both cover and temporal markers. The boy's music, originally thought irrelevant, was now a key element in reconstructing the intruder's actions. The notion of a double life, hinted at previously, began to crystallize. Someone familiar with the household had used its ordinary rhythms, the clock, the music, the servants' predictable habits, to execute a precise operation while leaving only the faintest traces of human error. Each minor irregularity, the soot, the fragments, the slightly misaligned furniture, formed a psychological signature. It spoke of a man who knew what he was doing, yet who was careful, nervous, and conscious of being observed. By mid-afternoon, I'd drawn a provisional diagram of movements, entry via the window, brief handling of the lamp, inspection of the surroundings, exit without detection. The timing of each action correlated imperfectly with the accounts of the household and neighbors, suggesting either deliberate misdirection or a minor miscalculation on the intruder's part. In either case, it provided a useful point of leverage for questioning. I spent the remainder of the day cross-referencing each observation, noting how minor actions, a glance at a mirror, the adjustment of curtains, the faint scuff of a shoe, aligned with or contradicted the stated chronology. The inconsistencies, though subtle, converged toward a single conclusion. The intruder was precise, yet fallible, careful, yet anxious, known in some manner to the household, yet not publicly acknowledged. As night approached, I permitted myself a small measure of satisfaction. The narrative, previously diffuse and scattered among minor observations, now began to cohere. The patterns were clear: the lamp, the window, the fragments, the shadows, the music, the minor misstatements, all spoke of a single, deliberate agent whose motives remained obscure, yet whose movements were increasingly intelligible. And so, as the household settled into its customary quiet, I prepared for the next stage, uncovering the hidden identity, or perhaps the double life, of the visitor whose careful steps had left the faintest, most telling trail. It is in these small, carefully orchestrated irregularities that the human mind, when observed with patience and precision, leaves its most revealing signature. By the following evening, the household had settled into a rhythm that suggested nothing unusual, yet I knew better. It is a remarkable aspect of human habit that, in the face of even minor disturbances, we cling to the familiar, as though maintaining appearances might render the extraordinary harmless. I, however, had long since learned that appearances conceal far more than they reveal. I spent the afternoon methodically observing the patterns of movement within the house, the precise intervals at which Fenwick moved between rooms, Mrs. Pargeter's measured, almost ritualized tasks, the mistress's absence, and the interplay of light and shadow across the drawing room. Each minor routine was a clue in disguise, each carefully timed act a measure of predictability for those trained to notice. It was during these observations that I began to arrange the conditions for what I have come to regard, in cases of this sort, as the theatrical phase of investigation. I adjusted the hall clock slightly, enough to create a margin for discrepancy, and noted the position of furniture and curtains in the drawing room. I allowed the window to remain ajar, subtly emphasizing the access point, while ensuring that fragments of glass previously collected lay conspicuously on the carpet. The aim, of course, was to observe responses rather than to provoke. One learns far more about motive and identity from the manner in which a person reacts to apparently trivial irregularities than from direct questioning alone. I was patient, knowing that the intruder, if present as I suspected, would respond instinctively to these cues. By early evening, a figure appeared at the threshold, tall, measured in gait, carrying the faint suggestion of hurried purpose restrained by civility. He paused for a fraction of a second, taking in the precise arrangement of light, shadow, and furniture, before stepping further into the room. Every movement betrayed both knowledge of the household and a careful observation of my own presence, or lack thereof. I remained seated, ostensibly absorbed in a book, yet acutely aware of the intruder's actions. A slight adjustment of the curtains, a careful examination of the lamp, and a lingering glance at the mirror, each act consistent with the psychological signature I had reconstructed. The pattern, now fully intelligible, revealed a man not merely visiting, but executing a deliberate plan, cognizant of observation, yet confident in his own control of the environment. It was then, with a precision that required no overt declaration, that I allowed the final piece of the puzzle to become apparent. A faint tap upon the brass of the sideboard, a hesitation, a touch, revealed the intruder's anxiety. He believed himself unobserved. He believed the traces left behind were inconsequential. Yet in these minute reactions, one sees more than the human eye ordinarily discerns. A concealed motive, a double life, and a careful manipulation of both time and environment. I rose, stepping into the intruder's line of sight with the calm authority of a man accustomed to both observation and deduction. "I believe, sir," I said, lightly, "that we have been speaking of trifles long enough. The lamp, the window, the fragments, they are not merely trifles, as one might suppose, but markers of a certain deliberate familiarity." He started slightly, a brief flush crossing his features, and for the first time, the carefully constructed mask of civility faltered. His hands, so composed moments before, betrayed a subtle tension. The stage was set, All that remained was to allow the narrative, assembled from fragments, observations, and minor inconsistencies, to be delivered in the quiet, inexorable logic for which one is accustomed to seeing in such cases. And so, standing amidst the carefully arranged household, I allowed the room itself to speak. The misaligned clock, the ajar window, the slightly tilted sideboard, the faint smudges of wax and soot, all were cues designed to elicit a response. The intruder, I knew, would now reveal either the final misstep or the truth behind the careful, concealed identity. The tension, imperceptible to the casual observer, was nearly palpable. The story, at last, was ready to unfold in its final, inevitable form. The intruder, still uncertain whether he was observed or merely suspected, shifted slightly, his gaze flicking toward the window, then the clock, and finally the sideboard. I allowed the silence to stretch, the candlelight reflecting off brass and glass, until every small irregularity, each fragment, each tilt of furniture, each smudge of soot, had registered in his mind. "Curious," I said lightly, "how even the smallest of disturbances can betray far more than one intends. The window ajar, the lamp handled, the fragments left upon the street. It is as if each action were a footnote to a story whose opening lines you cannot entirely conceal." He straightened, attempting the polite composure of a man caught unawares, yet unwilling to appear so. I do not understand what you mean, sir," he said, voice controlled but faintly sharp. I stepped closer, motioning to the brass fragments on the carpet. "Do you see these?" I asked. "They are not merely remnants of glass, nor traces of a lamp. They are signatures of timing, of habit, and of psychological intention. One does not handle a lamp in this manner unless one is familiar with the environment, unless one has rehearsed the movements, and unless one has a purpose beyond mere curiosity." His eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of recognition or fear passing across them. "You think I think," I interrupted, allowing the syllables to hang in the air, "that you have lived a double life in this household's shadow. By day, a visitor, a friend, a distant acquaintance. By afternoon, a meticulous observer, removing and replacing, handling light and glass, all while relying upon the routines of others to conceal your true purpose. Every clock, every curtain, every minor adjustment you presumed unnoticed has been noted." He took a step backward, almost imperceptibly toward the door. "That is absurd. I've done nothing improper." I shook my head, smiling faintly. "Improper? Perhaps. Or perhaps simply deliberate. The fragments, the soot, the ajar window, they speak more clearly than any verbal denial. Your careful manipulation of time and space, the minor discrepancies in each reported hour, all point to an intention to observe, to control, and, ultimately, to act without detection. Yet the traces of human error remain." He faltered, the carefully constructed mask cracking under the weight of cumulative observation. The precise schedule he had relied upon, the subtle manipulations of furniture and light, and the faint marks of hurried handling, all combined into a narrative from which there could be no retreat. "It was necessary," he murmured at last, voice low and slightly trembling. "I had to know. I had to see whether the household would notice, whether it would matter." "And it has mattered," I replied softly. "Not merely because of the lamp or the window, but because your actions have revealed more about yourself than about the household. The small, obsessive details, the soot on the brass, the tilt of the sideboard, the adjustment of the curtains, are not trivial. They are the very language in which human character expresses itself." He exhaled sharply, a mixture of relief and despair, as the logic became undeniable. "So, you have seen it all? Every movement?" "Every movement," I confirmed, "and every motive hinted at, yet revealed in the subtle traces of intention. Your familiarity, your anxiety, your meticulous planning, and your minor errors. All have formed a trail, and it is a trail that leads unmistakably to you. For a moment, he said nothing, the silence heavy with the gravity of exposure. Then, with a faintly ironic smile that betrayed both resignation and defiance, he sank into a chair. I suppose one cannot hide entirely. Not from someone like you. Indeed, I said. And now that the narrative is complete, it remains only for the consequences to follow. The household may resume its ordinary habits, and yet, of course, the story of your double life shall remain, indelibly recorded in the sequence of trifles that have betrayed it. He nodded slowly, and in that gesture lay the quiet acknowledgment of defeat. Not by force, nor by accusation, but by the inexorable logic of observation, deduction, and the cumulative weight of detail. The following morning dawned with a crisp, almost self-satisfied clarity, as though the household itself had exhaled in relief at the resolution of the previous day's tension. I spent the early hours walking the garden paths, noting the way dew clung to the hedges and the sunlight caught the lattice of the greenhouses. Little St. Aldhelm's appeared unchanged, yet beneath its placid surface, the intricate currents of human motive had run their course. By mid-morning, the mistress had returned, accompanied by a flurry of polite inquiries and anxious glances at the arrangement of furniture and light. Fenwick, ever steadfast, stood with quiet composure, though I detected the slightest relaxation in his posture, a silent acknowledgment that order had been restored and that the peculiar intrusions of the previous days had been accounted for. Mrs. Pargeter, meanwhile, busied herself with dusting the mantelpiece in a manner that suggested both relief and lingering curiosity. I allowed the mistress a moment's pause before speaking, letting the household absorb the subtle reassurance that the episode had concluded. "Your lamp, your window, your fragments of glass," I said lightly, "have all performed admirably in revealing what ordinary appearances can conceal. It is remarkable what is exposed when one observes without prejudice and when one allows the trivial to speak for itself." She inclined her head, eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and lingering astonishment. "And he?" she asked, a faint tremor in her voice. "He," I said, indicating the now quiet intruder, who had been quietly escorted to a comfortable chair in the corner, "has learned, as we all must, that precision and concealment may delay discovery, but cannot prevent it entirely. The details, the small, deliberate irregularities, speak more clearly than words ever could." The intruder, for his part, offered no further protest, only a faint, ironic smile, as though acknowledging the inevitability of logic and observation triumphing over artifice. There was, in his demeanor, a subtle relief, almost as if the exposure itself provided an unexpected absolution. I lingered for a moment, observing the household as it settled into its ordinary routines once more. The lamps were returned to their rightful places, the curtains drawn with deliberate care, and the clocks adjusted with painstaking accuracy. Yet, beneath the surface, the events of the past days had left their mark, not merely in fragments of glass or displaced furniture, but in the quiet knowledge that human intent leaves traces, however subtle, and that even the most careful of manipulations cannot escape the attentive eye. As I took my leave, stepping once more onto the dew-laden path of Little St. Aldhelm's, I allowed myself a faint smile. "Order restored, yet ever so slightly wiser," I murmured, more to myself than to any observer. The village retained its placid charm, the streets their polite civility, yet I knew that beneath the ordinary surfaces, the extraordinary had quietly unfolded and had been discerned. In the carriage awaiting my departure, I allowed my thoughts to drift toward the peculiar pleasures of deduction, the satisfaction of tracing the deliberate patterns hidden in seemingly trivial details, the quiet amusement of observing the human mind's predictable tendencies, and the enduring truth that, in the end, logic and patience reveal what secrecy and subtlety strive to conceal. As the gates of number 17 receded behind me, I could not resist a final, wry reflection. "It is curious," I murmured, "how a lamp, a window, and a fragment of glass can speak volumes, and even more curious how one learns, in observing them, that human nature is the most revealing element of all." With that, I tipped my hat to the village's ordinary tranquility, allowing the carriage to carry me away, leaving behind a household quietly restored, a visitor exposed, and a sequence of ordinary trifles transformed into a narrative of impeccable logic and subtle, enduring insight.